Two classic rock albums as you've never heard them before. Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells and Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon both have their 50th anniversary this year. Now, music tech expert Mark Jenkins presents these amazing albums arranged for the sounds of the Moog synthesizer in a stunning live solo performance with up-to-the-minute artificial intelligence video projections. Catch Tubular Bells and Dark Side of the Moon for the Moog synthesizer live at a music venue near you in 2023. Visit markjenkinsmusic.com. Dates include Cornwall's massive Clark Glaze Caverns on Saturday, June the 17th.
All right. Good afternoon, Mark. This is our second interview. Very happy to talk to you again. Let's talk about your project, the Tubular Bells and the Dark Side of the Moon. You mentioned that perhaps you are going to be touring in the United States and you're touring in the UK at this moment. Feel free to elaborate how you put it together, the concept, why doing these two albums, the visual behind the scenes, and so on and so forth.
Sure, yeah. Well, Tubular Bells was my first launch into music when I first heard it early in 1974. And when I started working in music journalism, I was able to meet Mike Oldfield a couple of times at two different studios over the years. And then when he moved to Spain, I was catching up with him with telephone interviews and so on. And when I met him, one was basically an interview for Songs of Distant Earth, and one was an interview, I think, for Tres Lunas, and also he was working on, it must have been what they call Tubular Bells 2006, if I'm correct. It was a complete new version of the album. And what people don't know, often people like synthesizer music, like Tangerine Dream, they like Tubular Bells, and they assume that Tubular Bells had got a lot of synthesizers, but it didn't. It had no synthesizers. It could have. 1973, Pink Floyd was using the EMS synthesizer, and the big Moog modulars were available, but Tubular Bells was done with organs, piano, glockenspiel, flute, guitars, and so on. So I said to him, if you're doing new versions of Tubular Bells, why don't you do an all synthesizer version? And he said, why don't you do it? So I did, but there was a 17-year gap. I did it in 2020. And at that time, it was the 45th anniversary of Tubular Bells. So I did a complete version of the album. There's about 40 or 50 instrumental passages in it. And I just assigned these to different synthesizer sounds, some of them quite authentic, but some of them a completely unconnected synthesizer sound. So, for example, when the announcement comes up on the end of the different instruments, it says grand piano, and I have a grand piano. But then when it says bass guitar, I have a bass synth noise that is not particularly like a bass guitar or anything. And when it says two slightly distorted guitars, they're not guitars, they're two different synth sounds. So it's a complete version of Tubular Bells, and then we go into the Sailor's Hornpipe. I added a couple of other hornpipes, and that was the CD which I put out a couple of years ago. And now for the 50th anniversary of Tubular Bells, I did a new edition, which is that one, with some bonus pieces on it. Mike Oldfield's single, pieces from the Killing Fields movie soundtrack, and another piece called The Green Ship, which is like another sailor's hornpipe. So I started performing that for the 50th anniversary, and I realized it was also the 50th anniversary of Dark Side of the Moon. That was a funny one, because when Tubular Bells came out, I immediately knew about it, but I don't remember Dark Side of the Moon when it appeared, and I always assumed it was a bit earlier. And I think the difference is that Mike Oldfield had this exposure on television and connected with Tubular Bells being used on The Exorcist and so on. But Pink Floyd was basically an albums band. So when Dark Side of the Moon was launched, I saw no mention of it at all. I mean, I was a teenager. I suppose I used to read Melody Maker, which is the music paper, weekly music paper, which is closed a long time ago now. So kind of at the last minute, I thought, well, I should be doing Dark Side of the Moon as well. And I put together about half the album, basically the half that was more to do with keyboards and had instrumental parts and less to do with singing. So I was performing Tubular Bells and half of Dark Side of the Moon. But what I've put together now, because I have so many concerts of this, is I have put together another full CD, which is that one. Oops, where is it there?
Yep.
And I filled it out by doing some other Pink Floyd music. Interstellar Overdrive, Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, Remember the Day, Comfortably Numb. So that fills it out with the Dark Side of the Moon sections to a full album length. Of course, the funny thing is that albums were so short when you just had two sides of vinyl. Some of them were 17 minutes each side. So you had a 34-minute album and it was done. So if you do a CD these days, you really have to look for some material to expand it. So as I say, I've ended up with most of Dark Side of the Moon plus some other Pink Floyd music. So we have a nice show. We do Tubular Bells in the first half, then we have a bit of an interval. Then we do Dark Side of the Moon in the second half, and it's all synchronized to computer graphic visual projections. Just this year, I've started using artificial intelligence artwork software, so I can generate huge numbers of computer-generated pictures on any theme, and these become the projected background for the pieces of music. I'm doing more and more of these as we go along. I've always wanted to do some kind of visual art, and I looked at early computer graphics, but I was never any good at it. But this artificial intelligence artwork works fantastically well in some cases, depending on the subject that you give it to work on. So I'm pleased now, after years and years, that as well as doing music, I can have some kind of input to the visual content as well. What I used to do was edit videos together. I'd go out with a video camera and shoot buildings and landscapes and this kind of thing, but there's only so much you can do with that if you want to actually create something yourself. So this artificial intelligence software, okay, again, you can say I'm not creating it myself. The artificial intelligence is doing most of the work. But at least I feel that I can come up with something that nobody's ever seen before.
How many shows are you doing? I know you have a gig coming up on next Saturday in the UK as well. That you planning to play in other cities in Europe and then come to United States perhaps?
Yes, I've got about 20 in the UK. The next one is in a cave, in an enormous cavern underground called Carnglaze Cavern in Cornwall, and that's quite a big concert venue. As I understand it, bands like Coldplay have performed there, and that's going to be a good opportunity to have a very unusual setting. And then the other shows are in music venues and concert halls and music pubs. I mean, a pub with a good stage and a PA setup. And then there's a big one in Germany near Leipzig towards the end of the year. All the dates are going to be on my website soon. So I'd hope to do a few more in Germany, perhaps something in France, and look at the USA. I've almost run out of time for the USA now because I have a show every 2 weeks, and I could get over to France or Germany, but you can't get away to the USA if you've only got 10 days between shows. But I might fit something in, or I might just extend it into 2024. I've had venues asking me if I can do Tubular Bells and Dark Side of the Moon into 2024, but I'm also going to be starting doing 50 years of Kraftwerk, or 50 years of Autobahn anyway, which is going to be a techno-pop sort of set for 2024. So I might keep them all on the go. And I'm thinking if there are any other albums. I mean, there are albums with important anniversaries coming up, because all this stuff from the 70s is now 50 years old.
Any possibility of doing early stuff from Tangerine Dreams? I don't know if you can, your own version of Ricochet.
Actually, I have more than that. I have because I put the book out a couple of years ago, 50 Years of Tangerine Dream. The original intention was to have a CD inserted in that, and I didn't quite have that done in time for the first batch of books, and then the book sold so quickly that I never finished a CD to insert in it. I mean, they were selling whether it had a CD in or not. So the CD is like the early years of Tangerine Dream, or the Virgin and pre-Virgin years. And it's a combination of actual cover versions with sort of pastiche versions in the style of. So I do a piece from Rubicon, pieces from Thief, Poland, and those 80s albums. And then out of the 70s, I do something in the style of Alpha Centauri. It's what we call cosmic music, with these early 70s electroacoustic sounds. And I do other pieces which are in the style of. And I performed that set once before COVID. I think I got to do it 2 weeks before COVID. So then that went completely quiet. So that will be launched again sometime soon. One thing you could look at is 50 years of Ricochet, which would be 2025. If I can plan that far ahead to 2025. The big modular system behind me is basically designed to be a Chris Frank's sequencing setup from the mid-70s. And it's all mode modules, the smaller Behringer clones of mode modules. And it uses two sequencers called the 960 module and a couple of systems to connect them together. So I can do actual 1975 style sequencing. It keeps you absolutely frantic. You have to keep on the move all the time to change the sequence length, transpose it up and down, put these ratcheting repeat notes in. So you can't just sit there and let it play itself. It becomes very monotonous. But I can do that now. I did a streaming concert of it, and it's on YouTube. So there's a possibility that I could do 50 years of Ricochet and sound actually fairly authentic. But we'll see exactly what comes up. As I say, I'm committed for 2024 to do Autobahn, which is a bit of a different approach, getting into the techno pop and the percussion pads and the synchronized visual graphics and this kind of thing. So there's plenty coming up.
And at the end of the show, you bring in, I assume, that a box of CD that you can sell at the end of every gig, or?
Oh yes, I mean most of the shows are tied to a particular CD, and
Yeah.
I went through a phase like everybody else. As download became more and more popular, I put all my albums available for download. But then these arguments started, particularly about Spotify making a lot of money but not giving any of it to musicians. I had download availability through certain companies, and then I found it was popping up on different companies which I'd never been informed about and had no way to keep an eye on. So I decided in the end to concentrate on CD sales.
Yep.
Last living people who still own a CD player. And I do meet now people who say, oh, I'd like to buy a CD, but I only play download files now. To which the answer is, oh, I'm sorry for you, because there's nothing like owning a CD or an LP. I don't think having a download file or something gives you any connection to the artist. This also came up because of the collaborative CDs I was doing, Modular Sessions, which has been going every month now for a couple of years. That's Modular Sessions number 2. And these are done in a batch of 100 CDs. You can see it says on the back there's a little
number,
gap in the bottom to put a number. That one has to make those exclusive and actually make a CD that you can own. So, you know, people can buy and sell and swap them and try to collect the whole set. And they've got something on their shelf to look at the end. Having a lot of downloads, I think the experience doesn't compare at all. What I did do, though, is I always did CDs in a jewel case or a digipack. And again, because of COVID, it became so expensive to mail these things to people, either to mail a box full to your distributor or to mail them out one at a time to the listeners. So now everything I do is in these slim wallets. It costs almost nothing to mail. It can go out as a letter. So I've got over some of the post-COVID difficulties which were pushing people away from CD. And people were starting to say, after they've collected CDs for 30 years, oh, all my shelves are full now of CDs. So at least with these tiny slim ones, it doesn't take up a lot of shelf space. So yeah, I'm very committed to CD now until the last CD player on earth stops working. And then I'll go back to download. But I think by that time, download will be a bit more sophisticated. You'll be able to have some version of the 16-page booklet with all the photos and sleeve notes. I put quite a lot of sleeve notes on the album saying what they're all about and how they're put together, and you completely lose that experience if you just purchase a download. Anyway, you know, just encouraging people to stick with the CD player for as long as possible.
Absolutely. As far as the modular session, you know, what was the motivation of putting the first one and then the second, the third one? I think now you have released like 30 or so, right?
Yeah. Well, again, that's to do with COVID. I had various things happening at the time COVID lockdowns started, and immediately you got a lot of musicians, particularly on Facebook, saying, "Oh, all my plans are banned and I can't tour." Not only can I not tour, but I'm not allowed to go and meet my fellow musicians in my band. We can't rehearse, we can't record anything either.
Sure.
So I thought it would be a good idea to give people a chance to collaborate by internet. And of course, that's become fairly common because you have people who live in Barbados or whatever sending their guitar parts up to where an album project is happening in Germany or the USA or whatever. So it's nothing new to exchange your parts by internet. But I thought, how about exchanging parts and not telling people what they're going to get? So basically, I put this first compilation together called Isolation with about 13 or 15 musicians. But nobody had made a complete piece. They had all sent a segment. I mean, in particular, somebody would do a sequencer or drum machine going along, and then somebody else would think about what the harmonies and the solo and the abstract synthesizer sounds would be. Some people took the basis and mangled it with a lot of filters, so they changed the nature of it a lot. And we ended up with about 12 or 13 pieces with 17 or 18 musicians featured. And it was all very interesting and surprising stuff. And some wonderful people joined in. One of the guitarists from Tangerine Dream, Julia Messenger, who used to sing with Klaus Schultz. She's a jazz singer, basically, so she improvises patterns of melodies. People from the USA, France, Germany, UK. So that was very popular and successful. And there were so many people wanting to be involved that I thought, oh, we could do more of these. And in fact, by the time I launched it, I thought it was possible to do one a month. The original one, Isolation, was not limited, but the one a month, they'd just done in 100 numbered copies, as I was showing you. So for the early 2 or 3, we had very cosmic ones with spacey titles. They're a bit like cosmic music from the early 70s. Then we had one that was all female musicians, a huge range of styles, new age, symphonic, minimalist, Berlin stuff. And then as some new instruments were launched, I got hold of a Korg wave state, which is very much to do with looping sequences. So there's a couple of issues that were very much based on that. And it's just kept going from one month to the next. The latest is number 17, which is that one. And I think I mentioned earlier, it's a piece of perpetual music. The last notes are the same as the first notes. So if your CD player can handle it, you can have endlessly playing looping music. And other issues have other ideas or concepts. One of them is all titles from science fiction films. One coming up in a couple of months is going to be all inspired by movies. Not all science fiction, some pieces by the James Bond films and other things. But the basis of the music is more or less the sort of Berlin sequencer style, with somebody has done sequencer pieces and somebody else has added sounds and effects and melodies to it. So it's going wonderfully well. Some people who pick up on issue 14 or 15 or 16 then go back and look at the list and they want to buy the whole set. So I now have people who have put in a permanent order to get every issue so they have the complete collection. And I have had to give it an end point. So it's going to end at the end of this year. There'll be 2 complete annual volumes, and then people will be able to look at buying the first 12 together in a box and then the second 12 together in a box. Also, a lot of the material for these was recorded not in this studio setup behind me, but in my previous studio from about 3 or 4 years ago. I was going to take it all apart and move, so I thought, well, I'll do a lot of basic backgrounds now, which I can develop later. So I had about 40 pieces, perhaps 6, 7, 8 minutes long, and these have been used up as we go through the modular sessions issues, and sometimes I send a piece out to somebody and say, there you go, that's your opening segment, work with that. And now I'm getting towards having used all those 40 initial pieces. So that's another good point to wind up these 2 annual sets at least, and then I'll build up some more pieces and contact some new people and pick it up a little bit later. But I think I had to give people an end in sight, otherwise it's going to go on endlessly.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, from my point of view, there, I have listened to a couple of things and a couple of CDs, and they're very good. So hopefully, we'll not end. You have a lot, people interested in buying, the stuff, and there's so many.
They sell quite well, but I have built up a backlog of back issues, so I want to cut that down first before proceeding to do more and more. And what I do with these is I put a YouTube video up with little excerpts from each piece. Yeah. Like there's 17 YouTube videos up on my channel, which is just Mark Jenkins music on YouTube. Yeah. So you get an idea of the style of each CD, but hopefully people will want to collect them all. There is some variation in style. One might be very much Berlin sequencers, and one might be a little bit more ambient or minimalist, but it's not so wide and crazy that people wouldn't be able to enjoy all of them. So I hope eventually to see people with this little bundle of CDs on their shelf and they're able to say, yes, I've got the whole set and I play them all the time.
Absolutely. I forgot to ask you, with respect to the interview you have done with Philip Glass, Depeche Mode, Tomita, Duran Duran, and so forth, are there a store somewhere? Do you know if there's like a website where they were kept?
Yes, there is now. I mean, there wasn't for years. And because, in terms of the technology, when I first started doing interviews, you'd have to type it on a typewriter hand and give it to the typesetters. And then when computers came in, I had Atari ST files. And then later on, I had Mac or PC files. But a lot of the stuff, as I gave it to the magazines, that was then lost effectively. But over the last couple of years, a very enterprising guy has started a website called musings.com. And he's finding all the old music magazines and scanning the articles. And so, he's arranged in a very systematic way where it can all be searched. So if you go to musings.com and you type Mark Jenkins as author, you can find everything that I ever submitted to these early magazines. Or you can type Klaus Schulze subject, and you can find every magazine article about Klaus Schulze. Now, unfortunately, he's only done a certain number of magazines. I believe he's done International Musician, which hasn't existed for a few years now. I think he's done Electronics and Music Maker. I think he's done Electronic Sound Maker. All these magazines have disappeared now. But he's done a wonderful job finding those. I think he's got every issue until the magazine disappeared. But on some, he just hasn't done it yet. For instance, he hasn't done Keyboard from the USA, and I don't know if he ever will. Of course, there's a copyright question, but I think he's been quite careful about making sure that nobody minds these things are posted up. And as I say, mostly they're from magazines. Not only the magazine doesn't exist anymore, but the company which published it doesn't exist. So there's no copyright question. But some of the others, like Keyboard, he may have bumped into a copyright question and just not been able to do it. But there you are, that's where to find some of these old interviews, musings.com.
Is it difficult to make a decent living? Is it difficult to make a decent living as a musician, Mark?
Is it difficult to make a living as a journalist?
Or some musician, both, some musician.
Sorry, you broke up a little bit as you're asking the question. Well, the magazine journalism field changes all the time. And like anything else, it's been devastated by the internet. Basically, when magazines as websites were invented, people started to think, well, why should I go out and buy a magazine once a month when I can get the information for nothing on a website? The difficulty was that the website couldn't charge you to read the information. And also in the early days, they couldn't charge advertisers either, because the advertisers could never be confident how many people were actually seeing it. So the paper magazine business was going down, but the internet magazine business had not really picked up. And it was a pretty devastating time during which a lot of magazines closed. Now, there's beginning to be some stability because everybody knows how busy the internet is. An advertiser can feel confident how many people are looking at a website, and as a result, they'll pay for an advert which pays people to put the website together. And the best example is the main magazine which I work for now, called Software.com, was launched a couple of years ago by a very experienced magazine editor, Gary Yelton. And the aim was to start it as a web magazine, and later on, as conditions improved, to have a paper version. And what happened was that the internet version took off quite well. So they've never done a paper version. But each month they make a new cover and post it on the internet as if it's a new monthly issue with new features in it. It's been taken over now by a guy called Nick Batsdorf, who also has a fantastic background in paper magazines, but he understands now that the place to be is to build it on the internet and keep pushing away at that. And he's getting more and more advertising, which funds you to keep the thing going. In terms of the journalists, if they have a full-time job, well, obviously that's gone down like anything else. In the past, a magazine might have 20 journalists working for it who all go into the office every day. And now there's nothing like that. And nobody goes into the office anyway, because it's all done by internet. Well, that's a saving for the publishing company if they don't need to have a big office. But it also means that they don't want or need to employ people in a full-time job that you can make a permanent living from. So that's music journalism. It's in a state of flux, but it's starting to show some direction now. As regards making a living as a musician, well, I chose the most difficult field to be in because not many people like electronic music, to be honest. Apart from Jean-Michel Jarre, Vangelis, Mike Oldfield, who established themselves in the 70s, there's not a big following for people sitting with half a dozen synthesizers and making music. There's lots of guys doing it, but you can't make a living with it. Now, of course, there is an area where you can make money, which is doing disco, dance music, oriented stuff. And this is often referred to now as electronic music. So you see an advert saying the world's biggest electronic music festival, and you think, oh, that's nice. It's going to be Jean-Michel Jarre and Klaus Schulze and Tangerine Dream. When you read the list, it's 50 DJs, one after another. And people call that electronic music, which is pathetic, unfortunately. But the funny thing is, of course, the sounds and the techniques are quite similar, but you just put it to a 4/4 bass drum and call it dance music. A lot of the people using modular systems, like this tiny one, instead of making very abstract sounds, have found a way to synchronize it to a bass drum beat and will improvise with the sequencer and the modular sounds. So again, if you want to own a modular system and play with it, you can either sit at home and put things on Bandcamp, or you can set it to a 4/4 bass drum beat, doing almost exactly the same noises and sequences, and go out to the clubs, as long as you're willing to stay up until 3 a.m., 4 a.m. Oh yes, your set will be at 3 a.m. So it's a bit of a young people's game.
Sure.
But there you are. I mean, it depends on how wide you make your definition. You can sit in a studio with synthesizers and software and compose songs, and you can do it in a dance style or a pop music style, and you can say, oh yes, I'm doing electronic music and I'm making a living and making money out of it. But these are the people who turn out the music for, or help turn out the music for Sia and Dua Lipa and all these high profile pop acts. So the people involved with those can say, oh yes, I'm doing electronic music and making a good living, but it depends on your definition.
Got it. Perfect. Why do you think that, so many great musicians, came from Germany, especially in Berlin, right? And the whereabouts, like the Klaus Schulze of this world, the Tangerine Dream, Edgar, obviously, Manuel Goshin, and so more. Why do you think that Berlin became the capital of electronic music in the world? And so many that I'm not mentioning here, but it's,
there is an answer. Yeah. I could bore you to death with it, but I'll try and do it in 5 lines.
Yep.
And I've written articles about this. Actually, there's one on synthandsoftware.com called 50 Years of Krautrock.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of books about krautrock, and they will basically tell you the same thing. It's to do with the Second World War.
Cool.
After the war, Germany was occupied by the Allies. there were a lot of US Air Force bases in particular, and they would organize entertainment for themselves, and they would bring over bands playing the latest in American music, which was first big band stuff, then rock and roll in the sense of Bill Haley and the Comets playing rock and roll. And then in the 60s, they were all listening to psychedelic groups like the Doors and this kind of thing. Now, the youth of Germany had been kind of forcibly separated from their own musical ideas, because in the war, it was very much militaristic and classical music. And the other style that was available was what's been called Schlager, which is a sort of Bavarian folk-based music. So for the young people of Germany, they had this choice of the old-fashioned German styles, which were not kind of politically acceptable anymore, or this imported from the USA stuff, which they quite liked, but they felt that it was being forced upon them. So the reason why all these krautrock and kosmisch bands started to come up, particularly from Berlin, was that they wanted to launch something which they felt was their own. They listened to American pop music, like the Doors and so on, but they didn't want to do that slavishly. In fact, what happened, because as you know, the Beatles started in Hamburg in 62, 63, and their style of early rock and roll music was being imposed upon the German youth. So the young German guys would learn these Beatles type songs and songs imported from the USA, and they would go out to the clubs and they'd play a set of 20 or 30 songs. So Edgar Frisser, to give you a very specific example, was going around clubs playing in bands, playing this sort of soul pop, psychedelic pop music, and making a living that way. But all the young German guys doing this became dissatisfied with it, and they became very, very psychedelic. People know the transition Edgar Frisser made from The Ones, which was his early band, into taking that apart and forming Tangerine Dream, which is completely free-form psychedelic. The only launch point that they accepted was Pink Floyd's Interstellar Overdrive from 1967, which was an improvised piece anyway. So they would play the first minute of that, and then they would go into completely free-form, smashing instruments and scraping them together and so on. So people often think of krautrock and the synthesizer music as ambient and new age and very relaxing. The whole thing was born out of anger, really, and the early versions were very chaotic. There's a wonderful video on YouTube of Tangerine Dream before they ever recorded anything, and I think the lineup was guitar, bass, and drums. The bassist was a guy called Happy Dieter, Klaus Schultz on drums, Edgar Frisser on guitar, and they'd basically do long psychedelic clashing improvisations. So that was how the Berlin scene was born. They all wanted to be experimentalists. They all wanted to launch something new. And then it was a complete coincidence that at that time, a new type of instrument became available. And they all jumped on it as soon as they could afford one, because the synthesizer would give them something completely unheard. And they all had the same thought. Edgar Froese, let's get synthesizers. Klaus Schultz, let's get organs and tapes and then synthesizers when I can afford one. Manuel Gotching launched Ashlar Temple, which is a psychedelic improvising rock band, but then let's get keyboards and sequencers as soon as we could get them. Michael Hernig was in Agitation Free, which is a psychedelic improvising rock band, but let's get synthesizers as soon as we can get them. So the whole scene was born out of this sort of post-World War II alienation. And they all wanted to launch something very personal and new, which they could say, this is mine. And that's why it came out of Germany. And then kind of a second wave came out of the USA, because the first wave in the USA with synthesizers was something completely different. It was kind of wacky advertising music and electric pop, a go-go on the Moog. Totally different from doing experimental music. It took a few years before people in the USA emerged, like Richard Burmer, Steve Roach, these sort of people. And they, before too long, evolved into a more new age ambient soundscape sort of style. So even they weren't absolutely following what the Germans did. The German style remained pretty much unique.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. That's very good, very well explained.
I was hoping it would be shorter than that, but that is, what happened. There's actually, somebody did a count, there's 70 books about krautrock, and most of them will have the first 2 pages saying that. Where did krautrock come from? Why synthesizers and new sounds? And what I forgot to mention was this. These young guys in Germany were going out in the evenings, playing in nightclubs, playing the soul pop cover versions. And then they were going home in the evening and they were tuning in to the WDR radio station in Cologne. And the head guy there was Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. Now, Stockhausen was a classically trained musician, up to date with the latest trends in contemporary classical music, and very quickly he started incorporating electronic sounds. This is in the mid-1950s, and what he could get hold of at the time was a test oscillator, a physics laboratory test oscillator, a tape machine, a ring modulator, and a couple of other electronic circuits. So he was making very, very advanced contemporary classical music. And the sounds that he was coming up with were very much like what you hear now if you listen to a synth musician playing a mellotron or playing gong sounds or whatever. Stockhausen was doing this with a choir, a giant gong, a physics lab oscillator, and a ring modulator. When you listen to his pieces like Kontakte and Stimmung, they have these huge ambient soundscapes, which are exactly like you're listening to the start of a Tangerine Dream album, but 10 years earlier.
Wow.
Funnily, these young guys were going out and playing soul pop music, which they didn't really like, and then going home and catching Karl-Heinz Stockhausen on the radio. So this, as soon as they could see some electronic instruments they could get hold of, was something they jumped on. So all the young Germans had heard Stockhausen. Tangerine Dream had definitely heard Stockhausen, but the biggest influence was Can, which was in Cologne where Stockhausen was working. 2 of the members had actually studied with Stockhausen, Hogesuke and Erwin Schmidt. So Can, which takes off in a sort of crazy ethnic world electronic pop direction, was also influenced by these electronic experiments from Cologne in the 1950s. It's just that they never picked up on sequencers and things too much. Basically, because the keyboard player, Erwin Schmidt, could play, so there was no need to set up a sequence pattern. And he did amazing things. He never got into synthesizers. He had a big effects unit built, which stood behind him. There's a couple of good YouTube videos. And it had tape echoes, ring modulator, and filters. So I listened to the Can albums as they're coming out in the 70s and 80s, and most of the sounds are completely unidentifiable. It sounds completely natural if you think about it. I'll say that again. It sounds completely natural if you don't think about it, but if you think about the individual sounds, you can't tell whether you're listening to a piano, a guitar, a percussion sound, a voice. And they have basically completely mangled every sound, particularly with the keyboard player, Erwin Schmidt. You hear these long passages on what sounds like a gamelan or a set of gongs, and it's actually his electric piano played through a ring modulator. And you see him on stage playing with his left hand and reaching behind him to manipulate the filters, ring modulators as he plays. Everybody go to YouTube and find the piece of Can playing Vernal Equinox. It's an absolutely amazing lesson on how you can mangle keyboard sounds. So he didn't even have to get into synthesizers. He had an organ, an electric piano, but as somebody said, he made them sound like the engine of a flying saucer. Really amazing sounds from Can, which you would have no way of identifying. Okay, if somebody plays a synthesizer, after a while you start saying, okay, he's playing a synthesizer and he's going dum 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 dum. But the Can sounds are something else completely. So, you know, that's the story of the development of krautrock and synthesizer music.
Yeah, very good answer. Also, at the same time, for people that folks that do like soundtracks and you know, Florian Fricket with Popol Vuh doing music for Werner Herzog movies also became very popular. It's something that I like as well. And it's
Yes,
again,
yeah. Beautiful. Well, as I understand it, Florian Fricker was from a wealthy family, and when the modular synthesizers were invented, he just bought, and he had the first, or one of the very early Moog modulars in Germany. And there's, I think, 2 Popol Vuh albums and a couple of clips on YouTube, which are basically him manipulating the synthesizer and somebody else playing congas or guitars. But he didn't take it all that far, and after about 3 albums, the synthesizer had gone, and he'd sold it to somebody. Nobody can quite work this out, but either his went to Chris Frank or his went to Eberhard Schöner, and Chris Frank got his from somebody else. But basically, Popol Vuh was very, very early into the electronic synthesizer stuff, but also got out of it very, very early. And the next 20 years is acoustic guitars, chanting, mellotron chords, and that's something that they applied to their Werner Herzog movie soundtracks as well. I believe there's a version of Popol Vuh still going. They've experimented a lot. There's some almost dance techno albums, but there's a lot to collect for somebody who wants the whole set.
That's the great music. I really like Popol Vuh, and I was lucky to interview a couple of you know, former musicians from the band, and you know, Florian Fricke unfortunately passed away too early, and but it was great. And Werner Herzog still going and created music. I think he lives in here in the United States, in Los Angeles, I think, and he's still doing movies, and somebody else is doing the soundtrack and so forth.
Yeah, a lot of his documentary movies are wonderful, visually very spectacular. In terms of bands that are still going, again, almost the last gasp for some of these bands was knocked out a bit by COVID, because there were krautrock bands that wanted to perform in 2020, 2021. And of those where the idea has still survived, coming out the other end of COVID lockdowns, Faust is still, and I saw a good Faust performance about a year ago in London, but I think with only one original member and a lineup of other interesting people. Amon Düül has been supposed to be playing in London for about 2 years, but it was put off first because of COVID and then because of individual illness within the band. So the last date announced was last week, and that's been put off. So it's been postponed for about 2.5, 3 years now. But I hope there'll be some output of Amon Düül still. On another front, you get bands like Hawkwind still going with some of the original members. Dave Brock is still there, so it's nice to see Hawkwind playing occasionally.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we'll see you playing live and many of the other bands playing for a long time. Some fans will like bands for never be able to retire, because they, either Genesis or the Pink Floyd or the Led Zeppelin in this world, they wanna keep on going to shows and keep on listening to their great music. So although people are, like you mentioned before, some people in the late 60s or early 70s, and they would like to retire, and fans say, no, do another tour, the final tour, the final reunion, or whatever. Yeah.
Well, they definitely still have fans, and they have young people picking up on the music who weren't even born when they started.
That's right, yeah.
But it is a case of last chance to see now. I'm going to see John McLaughlin playing in a week or so in London. I think he's 81. He says this will be his last major tour. But people who say this will be my last major tour then find the energy to play here and play there. So I don't think he's finished until he's finished.
Yeah.
And, hopefully a lot of these bands will keep going in one form or another. Then, of course, if they don't, you have to look for new performances coming up. And after the first wave of progressive rock bands who are now 70, 75 years old, you can look at the ones following, like Spock's Beard, I always liked, from the USA, and all these transatlantic Neil Morse type lineups, and they're still young guys, and there's plenty of shows with them. Also, somebody interesting who I saw a few weeks ago in London is Caitlin Aurelia Smith. She's very young. Do you know her?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know her name. Yeah.
So she was a classically educated musician who was introduced one day to a Buchla modular system that was dropped on her with absolutely no knowledge at all of how to use it. And she started doing, as you would when you're getting into a synthesizer, fairly abstract improvisations, and then something with more pattern, like Philip Glass, Terry Riley, repeated patterns. And then as the technology developed, she's got going with various loops and ways of singing with pitch shifters and looping her singing as well. So she has turned out doing a sort of electro pop or techno pop, but a little bit more abstract, not quite such a structured song, but something going on with patterns and vocals, which she now locks into a computer graphic projection which has been body mapped from her movements. So as she moves on stage, the projected figure follows her movements. That's a very sophisticated show that was on in London a couple of weeks ago. So there's always new musicians coming up, and there's always new things that are worth seeing. It's sad that we're losing, in some cases, these wonderful bands and artists who started in the 70s, but there'll never be a lack of new and exciting things to get into.
Yeah. Where did she end up playing, like you say, a couple of weeks ago? You don't remember the venue?
In London, there's a wonderful venue called King's Place. It was only built a couple of years ago, and again, it was just getting into the swing when COVID came, so it wasn't very busy.
King's Place, let me write myself a note.
King's Place, let me write myself a note. They've put on a long season of quite experimental and advanced music called Soundscapes. I went to see another show there by Robert Henke, who's the inventor of the Ableton Live software, co-inventor, and he does live loops and interfacing with computers of various types. So that there's good activity of new things coming up, but the basic core synthesizer music with sequencers playing in the old Berlin school style, you won't see all that much anymore. As somebody said, it was the music of the future which became the music of the past without ever becoming the music of the present.
That's right.
It didn't become a big market. It sounded futuristic, but now it sounds old-fashioned. And you won't get a big band on tour anymore that plays Berlin-style sequences. The scene, of course, is in Holland and Germany, where there's still some festivals happening. A few years ago, they would use a 2,000-seat concert hall, and now they're using a 400-seat concert hall. So that kind of shows the way things are going. The performances still exist, but it's a limited market. And of course, what's taken over from it is that people don't go out and perform, particularly if they still want big modular systems like this one, because they can sit at home and put some music on Bandcamp or on YouTube and get some followers and get people listening without having to kill themselves and go out and play.
On the road, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Apart from Tangerine Dream, you know, going out with their current lineup, which uses a vast pile of equipment, but still only about a fifth of the equipment that used to go out in the early years.
Absolutely, yeah.
You're just not going to see this Berlin sequencer music coming to a venue near you. So, you know, look up the old stuff on YouTube, buy the Bandcamp material, buy my wonderful CDs if you still have a CD player. So, you know, there's plenty of stuff to listen to.
Absolutely. Hey, Mark, it was very nice talking to you again. I'm quite sure we'll do a part 3 and a part 4 because you are like a walking encyclopedia. You have a lot of knowledge, a lot of different bands. You know.
I mean, I got interested in this type of music, and then basically I got a job working in it, both through music journalism and through doing music and organizing festivals and playing. So I have got a lot of inside information, some of which I can give away and some of which I can't.
Of course. No, I'm aware of that. Yeah. All right.
There you are. Yes, I'd be happy to speak another time.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much and good luck in the concert this weekend, man.
Oh, wonderful. Thanks, Claudio.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.